I remember my grandmother as a short, plump woman in a colorful headscarf who bustled about in the kitchen from early morning. And by evening, the table was groaning with meat pies, boiled potatoes with dill, salads, pelmeni, preserves for every taste, homemade kvass, and other delicacies in such quantities that an ordinary person simply could not eat. My grandfather was a tall and strong old man for his age, with a huge gray beard. In his youth, he was a respected hunter in the village, a carpenter and a jack of all trades, who was still sought after for various jobs, even from the city. I was a little afraid of my sullen and silent grandfather. But he was only like that on the outside because at the end of the day, he would always give my sister and me a colorful bird's milk candy or a white marshmallow wrapped in a bag. Sweets that our parents rarely allowed us to have. When my grandfather wasn't fixing something in the yard or digging in the garden, he liked to lock himself in his garage, which served as his workshop, where he made furniture or did his mysterious grandfatherly things. I loved our little village house, even though the TV didn't get any cartoon channels, and instead of a comfortable bathtub and shower, there was a strange, always dark building called a bathhouse on the property. But there was a wide, endless field, the edge of which was gilded by the setting sun. And it was nice to lie there, burying yourself in the tall grass. There was a swing made by the village kids and a large pond for swimming. There was a gray cat named Barsik and colorful cows wandering around the village without any supervision. Of course, there was a forest, not a stunted city park littered with drunks or a birch grove that you could see right through, but a dark, dense, a real Far Eastern forest. The kind where the tops of the fir trees block out the sky, and no matter how hot the summer day is, it always smells of dampness and mushrooms under their canopy. The forest was our favorite place. My grandparents strictly forbade us to go there, but who could stop us? We could walk there for hours, collecting pine cones and dried mushrooms, and looking for all kinds of adventures. I remember that at that time, I read the book The Wizard of Oz and told Anna the story of the yellow brick road, the very same road that led to the magical city, with towers shining with precious stones. Of course, I presented it not as fiction, but as the absolute truth, and that the road paved with yellow cobblestones was hidden somewhere in our forest. I even found an empty vodka bottle, broke off the neck, and fished out a glass marble, passing it off as a real emerald. I remember that, at that moment, Annie's delight knew no bounds, nor did the flood of tears when the marble was lost a couple of days later. My sister was crazy about this story, and I didn't discourage her. On the contrary, on warm summer days when we walked in the woods, I continued to tell stories that had long since gone beyond the bounds of Volkov's fairy tales, embellishing them with inventions I made up on the spot. Mostly, they were increasingly dark and frightening, about monsters and traps lying in wait, about black people walking on their heads, or about predatory trees lurking by the road and devouring little girls. I don't know why I did it. Out of mischief or just boredom. Or maybe I was flattered by the enthusiastic look of my younger sister looking up at me. Anya was 3 years younger, a naive and silly girl, ready to believe that the moon was made of Dutch cheese. She listened to me with her mouth open in amazement, and I was incredibly pleased with myself. This continued until I got bored. Soon I got bored with Anya, the village, the forest, and even the huge field with the setting sun. No, I continued to love my sister and my grandparents. But at 14, you have other priorities. Parties with friends become much cooler than collecting pine cones in the forest. Those who are younger suddenly seem like silly kids, and you imagine yourself as an adult who wants completely different things. You want to rebel and break rules, stay out until dawn, or hold hands with that cute girl who has been flirtatiously glancing at you during breaks. Gradually, Anya and I drifted apart. After all, I was 3 years older. What are 3 years? In reality, it's nothing. But when you're a teenager, 3 years is an insurmountable chasm that cannot be bridged. My sister was still a child, but I had already crossed the mysterious Rubicon of puberty, beyond which adult life beckoned temptingly. This naturally affected our trips to the village. For me, they simply stopped because I had already learned to throw tantrums and stand my ground. But for Anya, they remained mandatory. I don't know what kind of quirk my parents had about these village vacations. Probably they just wanted a break from us. So they sent us to the old folks for the whole summer. But my sister no longer felt the same excitement about these trips. As summer approached, she became anxious, often eavesdropping on her parents' conversations, pretending to have a fever or making up various tall tales. "I saw a horned man in the forest," she said once. But of course, I just waved it off. Now I realized that she was acting strangely, but at the time, I didn't notice anything. Or rather, I simply didn't care. If I hadn't been such a selfish and brainless jerk, I would have noticed the warning signs, of which there were plenty. They flashed in Anya's haunted eyes, in her trembling shoulders, in the broken phrases that repeatedly bounced off our indifference. Warning signs that foreshadowed a terrible end. Warning signs that something was wrong. The climax of this "something was wrong" was the ringing of the phone, which tore through the nighttime silence of our apartment. My parents could never be woken up, but I was struck as if by an electric shock and woke up. I rushed into the hallway to the phone. It was Anya calling. Her voice was quiet but firm and somehow grown up, which immediately made me feel anxious. "Sasha, wake your parents up. They need to come and get me out of here." I heard instead of a greeting. Half asleep, I couldn't gather my thoughts. I stood there for a long time, unable to say anything. "Sasha, wake up Dad. Get him on the phone." My sister repeated clearly and emphatically, as if it wasn't her but me who was a child. She was explaining something simple and obvious to me. I remember that this sudden role reversal even offended me, and without trying to understand the situation, I decided to snap back. "What are you doing? It's the middle of the night. I'm not waking anyone up. What do you want?" "Just wake up our parents," she repeated irritably. And after a short silence, she added in a trembling voice, "Someone's walking around the house, looking in the window. It's the horned monster from the forest. Sasha, wake up Dad. Please." I don't know why I did what I did. Perhaps I thought my sister's story was just another fantasy. Maybe I was only an adult in my own mind, and in reality, I was afraid to wake other adults. Or maybe I was overcome by a ridiculous resentment that some little girl dared to give me orders. But I didn't do anything. I told Anna to stop making things up. I told her she had dreamed it all. I told her to go to bed and not call at night. I said something else, which was followed by silence on the line. Then Anna's quiet crying. Then I said something else, but no one heard my last words. There were only short, dry beeps on the line. I stood there for a moment and hung up. I walked past my parents' bedroom and went to mine, where I covered myself with a blanket. A silly girl had a nightmare, I concluded with absolute certainty. I fell asleep easily and didn't dream. The next day, my grandmother called and said that Anya was missing. Those days are vaguely etched in my memory. I remember my mother crying silently in her bedroom while I was being questioned by an investigator. I remember being in a kind of emotional stupor for several days. And then I had a hysterical fit, and my parents had to call an ambulance. The doctor who arrived gave me some kind of injection, after which I fell asleep immediately. That night, for the first time in a long time, I had a dream. I dreamed of a yellow brick road. Anya was not found the next day, or the day after, or a week later. Meaningless summer days flew by. School bells rang in the corridors. Congratulations. Christmas trees and tangerines evaporated from memory. January blizzards subsided, and buds blossomed on the willow trees. I turned 17, and adult life lay ahead of me. Anya was forever 13. She disappeared without a trace. The police investigated the kidnapping theory for a long time, but in the end, they concluded that Anya had run away at night for some unknown reason and got lost in the forest. Finding a living person in the taiga is very difficult. Finding a dead person is practically impossible. Even my parents slowly began to come to terms with it, but I did not. The May sun warmed the budding leaves on the trees when I told them that I wanted to go to the village for the summer. My parents exchanged anxious glances, and my father, who was smoking on the balcony, coughed from the smoke. With the same zeal with which my parents had tried to get rid of us before, they began to persuade me to stay. But at 17, I was surprisingly stubborn. The reunion was warm and awkward at the same time. My grandmother rushed to hug me and, in her excitement, called me Misha instead of Sasha. My grandfather, slightly thinner but still lively, shook my hand firmly. We sat down to drink tea, and I listened spellbound to the silence outside the window, watching the sunbeams dance on the log walls just as I had done as a child. Then I threw my bag of belongings into the small room that Ania and I had once shared. 2 neatly made beds still stood along the walls. As I unpacked and laid out my things, I didn't notice a box in the closet. It tipped over from an awkward movement, and its contents spilled onto the floor. There were hair clips and ribbons, funny flower-patterned slippers, colored markers, dolls, Anya's things, which the old folks had carefully packed but apparently forgotten to send home. I felt a heavy lump rise in my throat. I knelt down and began to carefully put everything back, and only then did I notice a book lying at the bottom of the box. It was an old edition of The Wizard of Oz, which, judging by its appearance, my sister had read until it was worn out. Uninvited memories came flooding back. I sat down on the bed and turned the book over in my hands for a long time, my gaze wandering aimlessly around the room. My eyes stopped at the only window, and an involuntary shiver ran through my body. I had completely forgotten that the room's windows faced the forest. I spent the whole next day walking around the places of my childhood. On the one hand, nothing had changed, but on the other, a lot had changed. Someone had cut down the tree with a swing, and the pond where we used to splash around with such delight now looked like a swampy puddle. The gray cat Barsic had died of old age, and there were no village children to be seen. Probably, like me, they had stopped coming here. Only the forest remained the same as I had always remembered it. Mighty and dark, covering the sky, and even managing to stretch its coniferous branches over the abandoned plots. The village itself, which in my childhood had seemed like a vast expanse for traveling, was in fact a tiny hamlet with barely a dozen houses. The closest house to us was that of Baba Nura, a devout, quiet old woman. Further away lived deaf Grandpa Makar, followed by Baba Klava, whose cows tormented the villagers, loitering in the street and trampling the vegetable gardens. Aunt Nadia and her husband were the owners of the only grocery store in the village. There were a few other close and distant neighbors whom I either didn't know or couldn't remember their names. And, of course, Uncle Tolya himself. Uncle Tolya. He lived on the opposite side of the village, and when I was a child, my grandparents strictly forbade me to go near him. I often repeated his name to myself after my sister disappeared. Uncle Tolya was the youngest resident of the village, even though he was already in his 50s. He was known as an avid mushroom picker, but more as a drunkard, a poacher, and a criminal. A dashing man whose biography was quite typical for a dying post-Soviet village. No job, vodka, drunken fights, 2 stints in prison for some crimes, and then back to the same old life. After Ani disappeared, the police first turned their attention to Uncle Tolya. However, he had what is known as an ironclad alibi. He had spent a whole month in the city and had not been seen in the village. At least, that's what the investigator decided. In Uncle Tolya's yard, a mangy, scrawny sheepdog almost attacked me. Drooling, it followed me, running along the wire fence to which a chain was attached. I walked around the dilapidated little house several times, surrounded by a fence, behind which I could see murky windows and an overgrown vegetable garden. That was the end of my detective work, before it even began. The nasty dog followed me everywhere. I walked away and sat down on the side of the road, taking a pack of blue Winston cigarettes out of my pocket. I lit one. The excitement that had preceded the trip subsided, and I began to realize the absurdity of what was happening. What was I looking for here? Did I seriously plan to break into his house and find a torture chamber in the basement? I angrily stamped the cigarette butt into the ground, turned around, and headed home. On the way, I saw Grandma Nayura in the window. I stopped and waved to her cheerfully. The old woman did not respond. I felt a little hurt. She had probably forgotten me over the past few years. Then I smiled, pointing to my house, but she suddenly crossed herself and drew the curtains. I felt a little uneasy. I slept restlessly that night. The change of place, the fresh air, and the draft from the window took their toll. On top of that, my grandmother spent the whole evening banging pots and pans in the kitchen and rummaging around in her room. But even when everything quieted down, I didn't feel any better. I tossed and turned for a long time, and it was well after midnight before I finally fell asleep. I woke up with a start, overcome by an inexplicable feeling of danger. As soon as I opened my eyes, I let out a cry and hit the back of my head on the headboard. A motionless figure was standing over me, staring at me with unblinking eyes. Her eyes glowed dimly in the darkness of the room. "Grandma?" I whispered, trying to control my wildly beating heart. She was wearing only a nightgown, and I suddenly realized why she always wore a headscarf. My grandmother was almost completely bald, and a few insignificant strands of gray hair hung from her small head, covered with wrinkled old skin. She stood motionless, like a wax statue at the head of my bed, her eyes piercing me with a frightening glint. "Bah," I repeated, my voice already trembling. "Misha," she finally whispered hoarsely, "there's a horned head in my room. It's hiding under the bed again. Lately it started to smell really bad. Can you chase it away, Misha?" "What?" was all I could manage to say. Instead of answering, my grandmother slowly turned around and shuffled back to her room. I jumped up, hurriedly pulling on my pants. Grandma's room was a mess. The wardrobe was turned upside down, and photos had fallen off the shelves. Grandma pointed to her bed, covered with a beige sheet, the edge of which hung down to the floor, covering the space underneath. "There," she whispered briefly. I was thoroughly frightened. I listened carefully. I tried to whisper to my grandmother, but she remained silent, her frightened gaze fixed on the bed. The edge of the sheet fluttered slightly above the floor, either from an imperceptible draft or from something else I didn't want to think about at that moment. We stood in complete silence for several long minutes, and I felt my mouth go dry. The silence, the uncertainty, and my grandmother's strange behavior were pulling my nerves tight. At some point, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a mop from the hallway, returned to the room, hesitated for a second, and then yanked the edge of the sheet. There was no one under the bed, only a thick layer of dust on the wooden floor. I breathed a sigh of relief and turned to my grandmother. She looked at the dirty floor with fear and confusion. I made the bed again, and despite her feeble protests, put my grandmother to bed. I checked my grandfather's room. The old folks had been sleeping in separate rooms for the last few years, and made sure he was lying peacefully, covered with a blanket. Then I went out for some fresh air and lit a cigarette. I needed a couple of deep drags to calm down a little. What the hell just happened? I felt out of sorts the whole next day. I wanted to follow Uncle Tolia, who had left the house with a bag over his shoulder and headed toward the forest. But I lost sight of him almost immediately. I stood at the edge of the clearing, angry, sleep-deprived, and scratched by the bushes. At home, I tried to ask my grandmother about yesterday, but she smiled awkwardly and waved me away. "It was just a dream, Sasha. Grandma's old now. Forgive me, I scared myself and upset you. Come on, eat." I sat at the table while my grandmother bustled around, arranging homemade tomatoes on plates. She was wearing her colorful headscarf again. But now I knew that underneath it was a bald skull covered with yellowish, wrinkled skin and framed by the remains of hair. Pitiful strands that looked like cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. For some reason, this image stuck in my mind, causing a shameful revulsion that killed my appetite. My grandfather was not there. He had woken up and had breakfast very early and locked himself in his garage again. The sound of tools could be heard coming from there. Grandpa didn't come out to greet me in the morning, just as he hadn't come to dinner last night. It seemed that nothing interested him except his garage. "Did that horned creature take Anya?" I said aloud, surprising myself. And Grandma dropped the pepper shaker from her hands. "Grandson," she said instead of answering, moving closer to me and leaning her wrinkled face right over my plate. An unpleasant old lady smell hit my nose. "Here's what you do. Cover your window in the evening, but not with curtains. I'll give you an old blanket, a good thick one that belonged to my mother. And don't go out into the courtyard at night. I'll bolt the front door. Don't be afraid, dear. What would you do there at night? Better read a book. The TV is on. Play here at home. Just don't disturb your grandfather. He needs to rest. He has a bad heart. Don't wake him up at night. And most importantly, grandson, don't go walking in the forest. Forgive us, old people," she added, after an awkward pause that hung over the table. "All grandmothers and grandfathers have their quirks. You're not angry, are you?" I wasn't angry. I just closed the door to my room with a latch and tossed and turned restlessly on my bed, not knowing what to do with myself. My anxiety grew as darkness fell. Judging by the sounds coming from her room, my grandmother had no intention of going to bed and was once again making a racket. I could hear things falling and furniture being moved around. After tossing and turning for an hour and a half, I finally tried to fall asleep, but jumped up almost immediately when I heard hammering coming from her room. I slipped down the hallway and opened the door slightly to see my grandmother standing on a stool trying to nail a huge picture that she had torn from the wall over the window. I always remembered the old woman as a clean freak who dusted twice a day. But now her room was a complete mess. Literally, everything was turned upside down. On top of that, I had to cover my nose almost immediately from the disgusting smell that hit my nostrils. It was obvious why. The toilet was outside, and while I could still do my business, through the window when locked in the house at night, my grandmother had only a chamber pot standing next to her bed, which shook with every loud bang. These bangs caused its contents to spill little by little onto the floor. In a hurry, I closed the door. I returned to my room in a state of complete confusion. Now I understood why my grandfather spent all his free time in the garage and covered his head with blankets at night. Grandma must be sleepwalking. I've heard that happens at their age, and it's not dangerous. But then I remembered Anya, and I felt terribly ashamed. If a healthy guy like me was scared out of his wits yesterday, what must it have been like for my sister to spend the whole summer in this house? I sat down on the bed and took The Wizard of Oz out of the box. But I wasn't in the mood to read. I just leafed through the book, and it opened to a random page, revealing fields covered in clumsy, childish handwriting. I gasped. Forgetting the noise coming from my grandmother's room, I began to study it carefully and saw more and more notes. They were short notes, funny children's drawings, naive thoughts. Apparently, Anina's favorite book also served as a kind of diary for her. I couldn't help but smile when I saw notes about our legend, the yellow brick road. Of course, there was nothing special about them, just the guesses and fantasies of a little girl. But the last entry was radically different from the previous ones, making me shudder. On the page was a color illustration depicting a familiar scene. Ellie, Toto, the Scarecrow, the Tin Woodman, and the Lion walking along the yellow brick road. Only the faces of all the characters, like the road itself, were painted black. And at the bottom, in the same black letters, was written, "Under the Earth." I stared at this distorted picture for a long time, so I didn't immediately notice a symbol drawn next to it. It was incomprehensible and rather complicated. A long zigzag line framed by strokes, circles, and some kind of squiggles. I had never seen anything like it before. I flipped through the book to the very end, but that was the last entry. The discovery excited me. I stood up and began to pace the room. Of course, it was practically nothing, an empty clue, a mere trifle. But apparently, it was the only thing Anya had left before disappearing without a trace. Underground. A chill ran down my spine. I went to the window, threw open the shutters. Naturally, I didn't listen to my grandmother's instructions and just threw the smelly blanket into the corner and nervously lit a cigarette. A cloud of gray smoke slowly dissolved into the darkness of the night. Ahead, a black wall of forest rose up, illuminated only by the pale light of the rising moon. I stared at it anxiously. It no longer seemed like the magical, fairy tale place I remembered from my childhood. With my heart pounding, I watched the tops of the pine trees swaying, listened to the branches crackling and the trunks creaking. Something in its depths was constantly stirring, rustling, and moving. Moonlight filtered through the branches, creating a bizarre web of shadows. They swayed and crept under the roots as if alive. But I knew it was an illusion, a figment of my imagination, a delusion. That's why at first I didn't pay attention to the figure moving through the forest. A tall human silhouette slowly and silently glided between the pines parallel to the house and disappeared into the thicket. On its head were two short protrusions that looked like horns. I didn't notice how my knees were shaking. Holding my breath, I followed it with my eyes, not really understanding whether it was a figment of my imagination or not. At some point, the figure stopped and froze in place. Then it turned slightly, and I realized belatedly that it was now looking directly at me. Fear came over me and crashed down like a paralyzing cold wave. I cursed and immediately stubbed out my cigarette, not realizing that I was clearly visible in the lit window. I stepped back, grabbing the doorframe, and realized with horror that all these windows and doors were just dry pieces of wood, old boards that couldn't protect me from anything. "Misha!" I jumped back as if scalded and fell to the floor. My grandmother was banging on the door of my room, which was locked with a bolt. "Misha! There are eyes under the floorboards in my room. They're looking at me through the cracks." Jumping to my feet, I rushed to the window, but the horned silhouette was no longer visible. Just the forest, just shadows cast by the moonlight. My heart was pounding wildly. "Misha, those eyes are on the floor. Crush them, please." "My name is Sasha," I snapped, throwing the first thing I could find at the closed door. "Did you see anyone in the forest last night?" Grandfather suddenly stopped me in the hallway as I was about to slip out of the house, which was becoming unbearable. Caught off guard, I nodded silently. "Did he see you?" The old man leaned over me, staring at me with two cloudy eyes, one of which was disfigured by cataracts. My grandfather's stony face showed no emotion. Now that I saw him up close, I realized how bad he really looked. Exhausted and thin, even gaunt. His unkempt beard was stuck with breadcrumbs and dead insects. At that moment, I thought that the disappearance of his granddaughter had hit him hard, and that my grandmother's frightening lunacy would soon finish him off. Since the time I remembered him, my grandfather had become even more silent and unsociable, increasingly immersing himself in his work and preferring it to the company of his fellow villagers. He never went into the forest again, neither for berries, nor mushrooms, nor game, and didn't even look in its direction. Under my grandfather's unblinking gaze, I felt uncomfortable and frightened, shook my head. Grandfather didn't take his eyes off me. "They mustn't see you," he said firmly. "They're everywhere, you hear? They're hiding, watching, following me. I've seen them. They're waiting for a chance to get closer. They have a second skin." He suddenly grabbed me by the shoulders and pulled me close to his face. I could smell sweat and unbrushed teeth. His fingers dug into my shoulders, and I felt a strength unusual for his age and thinness. "Remember, they can take it off like clothes and put on a new one. They take off their skin and put on another one. They take off their skin and put on another one. They can look however they want, like you, like me, like your mom or your dad, and you won't be able to tell. They can't see you. They'll follow you until they catch you off guard." Grandfather held me in his iron grip, and I stood there, neither alive nor dead, afraid to utter a word. "But this is our home. Our home. No one will drive us away from here." Grandfather let go of me. but kept a steely gaze on me and added one last thing. Your sister knew that, and that's why they took her away. Don't go into the forest and listen to your grandmother. Without waiting for an answer, he left the house. I remained standing in the hallway, where the smell of cooking from the kitchen mixed with the smell of urine and dirty laundry from my grandmother's room, which even the closed door couldn't contain. I counted silently to myself. 3 days. I had been here for 3 days, counting the day I arrived. 89 days of summer lay ahead of me. I went back to my room and started throwing things into my backpack. Then I spat and went into the hallway, tearing the gray, greasy telephone receiver off the wall. I dialed our apartment number. The phone rang for a long time. Anya was probably standing there in the dark, too, while the horned creature scraped its fingers against her window and my grandmother raved in the next room. I clenched my teeth so hard they ground together. Something bad was happening here, and there had to be a reason for it. Without waiting for an answer, I hung up. The next week passed surprisingly calmly. Uncle Tolia quietly drank in his shack. My grandmother suddenly stopped sleepwalking and banging on everything at night. And my grandfather never once mentioned that conversation, was moderately cheerful, and even joked. I still stared at the forest in the evenings, but I no longer saw anyone there. As if at the flick of a switch, life in the village returned to its completely normal, boring routine. It seemed that everything had worked out, or, on the contrary, that nothing had happened, that I had overreacted to some coincidences and the old folks' quirks and had worked myself up. That would have been the case if there hadn't been a book under my bed with an inscription and a mysterious symbol, which I carefully copied onto a sheet of paper. Its meaning remained a mystery to me. I cautiously showed it to my grandparents, but they didn't react. I thought about asking the locals, but Baba Nura wouldn't even open the door for me. So I realized that I wouldn't get any help from the villagers. I managed to find a TV program about modern sects and watched it from beginning to end. But I didn't find anything even remotely similar. Gradually, I began to lose hope. On top of that, trouble came from an unexpected source. Aunt Nadia from the only store in the village flatly refused to sell me cigarettes. I was already heavily addicted to tobacco and had no desire to give up my only outlet in this godforsaken place. However, the shopkeeper was adamant. I begged, pleaded, argued, and implored. But Aunt Nadia just shook her 5 chins angrily, staring at me with her piggy eyes. Get out of here, you milk-sucker. It's not allowed. That's the law. Finally, she threatened that if I didn't get out of there right away, she would drag me out by the scruff of my neck and beat me in front of the whole village. And looking at her sumo wrestler's physique, I didn't doubt for a second that she could. In the city, I would have solved the problem easily. I would have simply asked one of the passers-by to buy me some cigarettes. There would always have been someone. But who could I ask here? Not some old lady or deaf old man. As I considered my options, I grew increasingly gloomy, unwilling to admit the obvious and putting off the decision until later. Only when the urge to smoke became unbearable did I give up and drag myself to the end of the village. I didn't like doing it, but it seemed I had no choice. It was only 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but Uncle Tolia was already tipsy. He agreed to help surprisingly easily and didn't even ask for a commission for his services. As we walked through the village, I was as black as a cloud, while Uncle Tolia, on the other hand, cheerfully chatted about all sorts of nonsense, which annoyed me terribly. I didn't like him, even if I didn't take into account the fact that I still suspected him of my sister's disappearance. I disliked him as much as you dislike your perpetually intoxicated neighbor or a homeless person who smells unpleasant on the bus. Uncle Tolya was a short but sturdy man, with a head resembling a lumpy rotten potato and bad teeth, who always smelled of alcohol and onions. When he was drunk, he liked to wave his fists, and I put a few bills in those calloused, earth-colored hands, which could easily have closed around Anya's throat. On top of that, Uncle Tolya was talking incessantly, and to drown out his unbearable babbling, I asked him about something neutral, like hunting or fishing. He frowned. I don't go anymore. Rarely. Why not? The forest has been ruined, he said curtly, scratching the back of his dirty head. And I don't advise you to go there either. I immediately forgot my dislike and pricked up my ears. How so? What do you mean, ruined? Uncle Tolya paused. He didn't like the sudden turn the conversation had taken. Well, things happen. They see all sorts of things there. Things that shouldn't be there. He replied evasively. He paused for a moment, but his natural talkativeness prevented him from holding back for long. Remember how Baba Klava's cows used to roam freely around the village? Now they're only in the fields and under supervision. Why? A couple of years ago, one went missing and was found in the forest. Someone had torn the heifer to pieces, broken its bones, skinned it, but didn't eat it, just left it in the middle of the forest. They only took the head with them. Then another one went missing. It was found. It was a gruesome sight. I'll answer you. A couple of months ago, Koka Stakin disappeared. Well, the one with the ends. Of course, he was a good-for-nothing man. And they say he drowned himself in the river, but I don't believe it. I feel like there's more to it than that. And the people who live near the forest, they've become strange. Like your old folks over there. They're completely senile. I swallowed nervously. Of course, I understand old age and all that. We'll all be on our own someday. But I don't think that's the only reason. Why are you all so quiet? Why don't you leave? Why don't you tell anyone? I exclaimed. Kid, are you stupid? Uncle Tolya replied calmly. Where would we go? Who would we tell? Look around you. We're all living dead people in our 90s. We've lived here all our lives, and we'll die here. You have no business here. Why did you come? Have you forgotten what happened to your sister? I blushed with anger and wanted to hit him. But I knew I couldn't handle a grown man. We walked the last part of the way in silence. Uncle Tolya went into the store, and I stayed outside. He was gone for a long time. Probably the landlady had figured out my plan and was now arguing with Uncle Tolya. I got tired of waiting and sat down on the steps, taking the album sheet with the mysterious symbol out of my pocket and trying to decipher it once again. Zigzags, circles, lines, squiggles. Nothing came to mind. Absolutely nothing. Finally, the door swung open, and Uncle Tolya unceremoniously poked me in the ribs with the toe of his boot. Come on, young man, he shouted, throwing me several bundles and clutching a half-liter of some kind of booze under his arm. Oh, what's this? Going on a hike? I stared at him in confusion. Well, this? He pointed to the sheet of paper. I didn't understand. Well, it's a map, isn't it? Just a guess. It looks like a village, a pond, and here's a windbreak. This squiggle here, yes, that's roughly how you go around it. I looked back and forth between him and the album page with the scribbles until Uncle Tolya waved his hand and went off to continue his solo celebration. The next few days, I spent trying to verify this crazy theory. Of course, Uncle Tolia was just a drunken criminal who had drunk away what was left of his brain. Probably one of those people who see Masonic symbols even on a packet of macaroni. And even though some elements of the drawing seemed to match the location of local landmarks, it didn't look like a map at all. However, no matter how hard I tried to figure out the damn drawing, I simply had no other ideas about it. The forest was gloomy, regardless of the weather. I tried to follow the map, making small notches on the trees with a knife I had previously stolen from the kitchen. Along the way, I remembered that there was indeed a large windbreak in this part of the forest, which was almost impossible to pass through directly, so people rarely went there. According to Uncle Tola, the map showed some kind of clever detour, but it was too sketchy to understand where it was. I often got lost, climbed dried-up tree trunks, fought my way through thickets of rose hips and blackberries, and returned back to where I started. On the first day, I returned home closer to evening, exhausted and bitten by mosquitoes. My grandparents asked me where I had been. I replied that I had fallen asleep lying in the field. The second day was much the same. On the third day, I unexpectedly stumbled upon a dead carcass. It was some kind of small animal, a dog or a fox. It was impossible to tell because the animal's skin had been stripped off, and maggots were writhing disgustingly in the rotting flesh. I stared at the poor animal for a long time, feeling my resolve slowly drain away and my legs tremble. That day, I stayed in the forest longer than usual and only left for the village at dusk, driven by an uneasy feeling that someone was watching me from the thicket. That same night, I heard someone walking outside my window for the first time. Heavy footsteps slowly followed back and forth, measuring the outer wall. I hid under the bed, shaking all over. I pressed myself against the wall, clutching a blunt kitchen knife in my hands, which couldn't even cut a chicken carcass. I really wanted to scream. I really wanted to. I wanted to wake up my grandparents, but I was afraid to even breathe too loudly. He'll go away, won't he? He can't just break into the house like that, can he? At some point, the darkness of the room became even more impenetrable, and I realized that something was looking in the window, blocking the dim twinkling of the stars. There was a sharp scraping sound on the glass, a dull crunch of the window frame resisting. "Misha!" A piercing old woman's scream cut through the silence, and I heard the slap of bare feet on the floor. "Misha!" My heart sank into my heels. The room grew lighter, and the heavy footsteps outside the window began to recede. My grandmother banged on my door. "Misha, where are you? Misha!" I continued to lie under the bed, biting my knuckles until they bled, hoping that I had just collapsed from a fever and that everything that was happening was a fever dream. The knocking on the door stopped, but I immediately saw the door to Barsik's room open at the bottom, as if in slow motion, and my grandmother's head slowly emerge. Just as bald, with tufts of gray hair resembling strands of cobwebs, she looked around the room intently, grinning stupidly in the darkness. In the darkness, her neck seemed impossibly thin and long. "Misha, there's someone in my room. Can I sleep in yours?" Grandma tried to squeeze through the opening, but couldn't, and with a discontented grumble, she disappeared behind the door. I didn't sleep a wink that night. On the fourth day, I didn't dare go anywhere, nor did I on the fifth. My grandmother and grandfather asked if I was all right, and I said I was sick. My grandmother threw up her hands, and my grandfather frowned. He asked if I had been walking in the woods, and I shook my head. On the morning of the 6th day, I finally made up my mind. As always, I had only the old flashlight my father had given me, a kitchen knife, and a bag of sandwiches. I followed the path I had already trodden, then made my way through the wild forest, through sharp branches and fallen trunks, carefully marking the way with notches on the trees. I walked for a very long time, automatically making my way, until I suddenly realized that the obstacles had ended. The windbreak was behind me, and I came out into an open area. From here, the damp pine forest stretched out in all directions into the endless distance. My knees buckled. It turned out that Uncle Tolya was wrong, and the map wasn't a map at all. If that was the case, I should have already reached the marked point or passed it. But I hadn't noticed anything. I went back a little, sat down on a fallen tree, and took out my bag of sandwiches. While I was eating, my gaze wandered aimlessly around and soon caught on something unnatural. It was difficult to say what it was. A trace of external influence imprinted in the middle of the untouched wild forest. A barely noticeable disturbance in the environment. Hidden, but not well enough. I went there, carefully examining the unusually flat area with short grass. I walked back and forth, rustling the fallen leaves with my foot. The toe of my boot hit the cover of a wooden hatch. I swallowed nervously. Soon I found a rusty ring, and pulling it, I opened the entrance to a narrow tunnel leading somewhere into the darkness. I shone my flashlight. The floor of the tunnel was earthen, but at the bottom it was paved with rough cobblestones, and several stones were childishly painted yellow with chalk. Sitting on the edge of the pit, I smoked probably half a pack. I didn't have a watch with me, and it was difficult to tell the time under the dark pine trees. But it seemed to be around afternoon. Ideally, I should have gone back, but I was frightened by the thought that whatever had made this hole would discover signs of my presence tomorrow, and the consequences would be unpredictable. The yellow chalk on the stones left no doubt that this was exactly what I was looking for. And besides, this was exactly what I had come for, right? I took a few deep breaths. I checked the batteries in my flashlight, and I jumped down. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, and I kept scraping my head on the dirt ceiling. There was no lighting, and the weak beam from my flashlight was the only source of light. I moved forward cautiously, timing my steps by the puffs of steam escaping from my mouth. But I quickly lost count. I walked until the tunnel came to a fork. I went right. The same damp walls, stale air, and the wandering beam of the flashlight ahead. Another fork, I went straight, then another, and I turned somewhere again. I lost track of time, even approximately, and it seemed to me that I had been walking for a very long time, although in reality I had barely covered a kilometer or two. Finally, the tiny spot of light from the flashlight began to grow, increasing in size, and was no longer lost in the darkness of the corridor, but came to rest against a damp vertical wall. A wooden ladder was attached to the wall, leading up to a closed hatch. I listened. I checked the steps for stability and gently pushed the hatch cover. It didn't budge, but it wasn't locked. It seemed to be simply weighed down by something heavy on the other side. I lifted it just enough to peek through the narrow crack and cautiously looked around. There didn't seem to be anything dangerous. After fiddling with the hatch for a while, I managed to push the load aside. It turned out to be a sack filled with earth. It was lighter upstairs. The ceiling was high, and the walls were thick and planked. To the left, Boxes were piled up in disorder. To the right was a roughly hewn table with tools scattered on it. An axe, a hammer, a pile of rusty knives, awls, sharpeners, and sickles. On the wall were rows of jagged circular saw blades. As I slid the beam of my flashlight along the wall, I almost cried out, covering my mouth with my hand, when horned shadows crept across the wall. 2 dried bulls' heads were nailed to the ceiling. I continued to look around, not allowing myself to think about what was happening, and thereby drive myself into a state of uncontrollable panic that would end in nothing good. Not far away was another wide workbench with something that I at first took for a roll of fabric, but it wasn't. I moved closer and felt the sandwiches I had eaten start to come back up. I had only heard about such things in documentaries about the Middle Ages, and even in my worst nightmares, I could not have imagined that I would ever see such a thing with my own eyes. Stretched out on the table, tied with ropes, was dried human skin, removed from the nape of the neck to the soles of the feet. It gave off a faint but pungent smell of rot mixed with some kind of chemical. I immediately turned away and leaned against the wall. Looking around frantically and fighting the nausea that was rising in me, I scanned the room, and in the back of my mind, a thought arose. So horrible and simple that I simply refused to believe it. I ran my fingers over the wooden table with the tools, assessed the walls, their size and proportions, the sharp teeth of the saws and chisels, neatly arranged in order, inhaled the smell of varnish and paint. And at some point, I understood everything. I understood and ran, not even bothering to close the hatch behind me, not caring about the traces of my presence. I dove into the darkness of the tunnel, and the beam of my flashlight darted frantically around the underground passage. For a long time, it seemed like a very long time, I heard only my footsteps, the roar of blood in my ears, and my own breathing, until I crawled out of the cramped and narrow darkness into a vast darkness full of mysterious sounds. Night had already fallen above. I crawled on all fours. Then I ran. The knife fell out and was lost somewhere in the grass, and the flashlight batteries began to fail. The full moon was hidden behind the clouds. I was saved by my own marks on the trees and the fact that I knew the way relatively well. When I reached the outskirts of the village, barely alive with fear and exhaustion, I saw that the lights in our house were out. Fortunately, I was lucky. My grandmother had forgotten to lock the door. The hallway was dark. I felt my way to the phone, picked up the receiver, and dialed the number with trembling fingers. The long beeps stretched the wait into eternity. I cursed, hit the lever, and dialed again. Nothing. As always, my parents were impossible to wake up. I felt tears of despair running down my cheeks and angrily smashed the phone against the doorframe. In my room, I began to frantically gather my things, grabbing the first things that came to hand and stuffing them into my backpack. I ran to the exit, but stopped at the door. I still had a glimmer of hope that this was all some kind of delusion, just a coincidence. It went silent as soon as I entered my grandfather's room and gently pushed the body hidden under the blankets. A straw effigy fell to the floor. I ran into the forest. Perhaps I wasn't thinking clearly at the time, but I thought the road was taking too long. And if I went west through the thicket, I could reach the river, wade across it, and from there it was only a stone's throw to the next village. There was a police station there, a 24-hour guest house for truck drivers. I had to go through the forest, but the forest was just a forest. I had run only a short distance when I heard the crackling of branches and a noise somewhere to my left. I immediately quickened my pace, but it soon turned into heavy footsteps and hoarse muttering coming from somewhere behind me. In the light of the full moon emerging from behind the clouds, a white skull crowned with a pair of short horns flashed between the tree trunks. "This can't be. It just can't be." I screamed and ran with all my might. But the horror that was overwhelming me only made me cling to the branches and slide across the grass. My pursuer was rapidly approaching, and I could literally feel his presence behind me, a terrifying, broken whisper reaching my ears. "Who are you? Who are you? Come closer, closer. Come here, you abomination. I'll see who you are. I'll see what's under your skin. I'll peel it off. I'll peel off your skin. I'll peel off your skin. I'll peel it off." I gasped for air, turning it into a cry for help. But in the back of my mind, I already knew that this was the end. At some point, I was roughly pushed, and something sharp dug into my side. I fell to the ground. It became unbearably difficult to breathe. It hurt a lot. I only remember fragments of what happened next. A terrible crash broke the silence of the night. Then I saw Uncle Tolia's pale face leaning over me. He was rushing around and tearing his t-shirt to pieces, his hands covered in blood, apparently mine. Then Uncle Tolia squeezed me in his bear hug and carried me somewhere for a long time. And I could see the barrel of a gun dangling from his back. Then there was light, people, doctors, conversations, cars with sirens, a white ceiling. And it all merged into a single colorful fireworks display of images without details. And somewhere far beyond all this, in the forest, dragging his shot legs behind him, was the man I could no longer call my grandfather, gasping and moaning. I realized this when, after passing through an underground tunnel, I found myself not in the lair of a forest monster, but in our own garage. At that time, I did not yet know words such as dementia, acute schizophrenic disorder, twilight confusion, and other frightening terms. And even now, I have little understanding of them. All I know is that the first changes were insignificant and almost imperceptible, attributed to the usual quirks of old age, exacerbated by loneliness. Over time, they turned my grandmother into a crazy hag who raged through the house at night and forced my grandfather to wear a bull's skull on his face to hunt down those who were awake. I was incredibly lucky that it was on that very night that Uncle Tolia decided to check his hiding place with something not entirely legal. I was lucky that the wound was shallow, and I got away with a slight fright. I was luckier than Kolish Staken, whose neatly removed skin I found in the garage. My grandfather had always been a good hunter, and even in his madness, he hadn't lost his skills. Luckier than my sister. Even as an adult, I never tried to find out if they found her mutilated body among all those garages, basements, tunnels, and hiding places, of which they found quite a few. Because I was afraid to hear the answer, and besides, it was obvious to everyone. The old folks' house in the village was burned down. Someone from the neighborhood did it. But we didn't mourn it. They were both locked up in a mental hospital for the rest of their lives, and neither my mom and dad nor I ever tried to keep in touch with them. Even when the death certificates arrived one after the other, I just threw them in the trash. Maybe that was wrong. After all, a sick person is not to blame for what they do, even if their actions are terrible, right? My parents blamed themselves. But I didn't blame them. Maybe they weren't good parents, but I wasn't a good brother either. Twice a year, I visit my sister's grave, where a girl who will forever be 13 looks at me from a photograph. And I ask myself the same question. Who is to blame for what happened? But I can't find the answer.